once upon a time, the current gen OU tier had millions of games more than VGC on Pokemon Showdown, but that isn't true anymore. VGC definitely gets more games than Pokemon Showdown, and the question really, well, one is that VGC is rising a lot and OU is actually going down, and we'll talk about that later. But the question is this a bad thing? Does it mean Smogon's declining? Why is it declining if it is? And honestly, there's all a very good explanation for the results we're seeing right now. And it's not that Smogon is dying. In fact, it's actually not doing that bad. It's actually doing well. However, there is some context that you need to understand. I have a list of graphs here. I actually created a script to compile the battle data for the past 10 years or so. 2014 is the first recorded data that we have access to. Now, the first graph here is the difference between OU and VGC, and at its peak, OU had millions of games more than VGC, but as of late, VGC has more games than OU. Number of games played is not a perfect metric. For one, VGC games are shorter so that you can play more games in the same amount of time, so it's not a complete comparison. I call it the best comparison because there's really no other metric we have. We're using number of games as proxy for how popular it is. Even though VGC games are shorter, you can clearly see there is a big difference from millions of games to, trending in the other direction. And this doesn't even account all the games played on the cartridge. It's only on Pokemon Showdown. So there's a lot of gaming that goes on the cartridge, especially if you're in Japan or Korea or a non-English speaking region who doesn't even use Pokemon Showdown. Now we have the number of VGC games by month over the past 10 years, and you can see that Gen 8 and Gen 9 is really when it started to pick up. Now, there are a couple of reasons why VGC has grown so much compared to everything, really. It's just an astronomical growth, right? So I've narrowed it down to a couple of reasons that I want to talk about. One is that it's simpler to get Pokemon in-game. Now with breeding is much easier since Generation 8. It's like you have the bottle caps and you don't have to be grinding as much. There's still some grinding, but overall it's relatively tame. Like, you can build a team, to be honest. Like, there's some paywall aspects to it, but it's overall easier than before. And when building teams are easier, the format's going to have more interest. You're going to have more interest. You're going to have more everything, really. And that translates to Pokemon Showdown. So even though it's easier to build in-game, it makes the format as a whole more popular, and that makes Pokemon Showdown more popular too. Number two is that the Switch, Pokemon games and the Switch as a whole completely outperformed the 3DS from my understanding. So what you're seeing here is VGC growing because Pokemon is growing, and there was simply more Pokemon being played on the Switch than on the 3DS. There's COVID effects as well, but you're seeing that the Switch is simply better than the 3DS, and that's why you're seeing this gain. There's also, the Wolfie VGC effect. Now, ordinarily, I wouldn't describe the actions of an individual towards, entire macro effects. Typically, it's very easy to confuse causation and correlation and stuff. But the reason I do bring it up here is because typically you talk about the conversion rate, right? If 1,000 people watch Yu-Gi-Oh! In the morning, maybe 300 of them are buying a deck of cards, maybe 10 of them are getting really good, and maybe one person goes to a Yu-Gi-Oh! Tournament, right? Conversion rates are typically very, very tiny for anything. Now, if Wolfie VGC gets 1 million views, even a tiny part of 1 million is still a lot of people. In that regard, I do think Wolfie VGC probably has an effect on growing the VGC game as well, but you have to take it with the context that VGC was always going to see an increase with the increase in the Switch and the increase in better breeding mechanics. This is VGC's growth, and I think it's really cool what they're doing, and it's definitely true. VGC is probably the most popular way to play competitive Pokemon right now. Well, not exactly, but again, we'll get to that. Now we go into some of the more interesting graphs here, right? We see the number of OU games over time. And as you can tell, OU games are declining. Simply put, they are going down. Now, unfortunately, that is a trend you're going to see in every single current generation tier. UU is also going down. RU, NU, PU, Little Cup, they're all going down. Does that mean Smogon is dying? Does it mean that Smogon is on the decline? Because it's very clear. OU's going down, UU's going down. Every current generation tier is in fact going down. But there is actually a good reason for that to happen, and it's national dex. What's happening is not that Smogon is declining, but it's actually getting split up into more and more formats. This is a cumulative graph of what it looks like when you add in National Dex OU as well. And when you look at the graph now after adding National Dex OU, you can see it's actually a straight line. It's pretty stagnant. It's not going down. If you look at OU here, it's actually going down, but in reality, it's stagnant. It's just staying, the same level. Smogon isn't declining. It's just being split up into more and more tiers, and National Dex is a pretty big culprit because it's honestly like a very similar parallel to OU, except people just like, having access to their favorite Pokemon. They like Z moves. They like Mega Pokemon. There's no real... Oh yeah, that's another thing. I see people talking about, the metagame, how, Gen 9's a really bad metagame, that's why no one's playing Gen 9. But one, empirically, you can see the drop-off really starts around the starting of Gen 8 with Nat Dex, but also anecdotally, I've seen people complain about Gen 9, people complain about Gen 8 with Heavy Duty Boot, people complain about Gen 7 with the variants of Z moves too. People will always complain. The people who hate a metagame so much that they're moving around isn't, in my opinion, a really strong factor contributing to decline. Maybe there are people who say, oh, King Gambit, I don't want to play with that, let me go to Nat Dex OU where it's banned. That is a portion, but when you're talking about in the millions of games region of disparity, that's not really too relevant. Maybe you have, 100 people, 1,000 people who care so much about King Gambit that they switch formats, but realistically, at a macro level, you're really not seeing those types of effects take place. The real culprit is National Dex, I guess splitting up the player base. Now, whether that's a problem or not really comes to your interpretation. Does it really matter that OU is declining if people are satisfied playing Nat Dex OU? Isn't that the point of Smogon, where you can have different formats, you have different things available to you? Whether or not it's a bad thing, I'm not going to ascribe any value to it, because I don't really think it's a bad thing, but you could argue it is. But that's really the idea. Now, to contrast that, I actually want to show you Gen 3 OU, and actually Gen 4 OU, Gen 5 OU, they actually have a similar pattern where they're actually growing. One thing you have to keep in mind is the scale of it all. This is in the hundreds of thousands, meanwhile OU is in the scale of the millions. So this is like 10% of the entire picture here, but you can still see it's growing, right? It's not like Smogon is dying. It's just that things are getting redistributed between what people are playing. People are not playing current generation OU, UU, RU, NUPU, Little Cup. They're moving into National Dex, just splitting it up, which is natural when you have a lot of tiers, and they're splitting up into the older generations as well. Gen 5 also going up, for example. This is the final graph, and you take every format, you combine every format. So even though OU is on a decline, if you combine every format, is Smogon on a decline? No, not really. You can see it's actually relatively stagnant. It's just almost a straight line, essentially. Now, you could argue that being stagnant itself is bad. You should be growing more. Like how VGC is growing, why isn't Smogon growing as much? You could make that argument, but ultimately it is stagnant to an extent. But it's not dying, and that's really what I wanted to talk about, that things are moving around, but they're not dying, at least in my opinion. Now, obviously, a lot of data means you have a lot of ways to interpret it, so I'm interested in hearing what you think. So let me know in the comment section, is Smogon dying? Is VGC simply growing? It's the official format, right? What do you think? And let me know down below.